So at first what I'd like to do is to go and to try to do the exercise, which very often I believe we in a very collective sense don't do enough, to put ourselves in the shoes of our customers and to think about what is the perception and what is the reality of receiving emails on a daily basis. There are ample evidence that we can see that the quantity of email that are sent and received by people is quite high. You have some facts on the first sheets showing that basically there's actually a pretty decent percentage of people who receive over 100 emails a day. So it's not only a feeling that email can be overwhelming, it's a reality, and to go through them on a daily basis is something which is a challenge, and we all know that, so that's not anything new. That's a reality which I mean we all know. Now I believe there is one thing that we have a tendency to think about wrongly when it comes to what our clients are perceiving when receiving email, and it has a lot to do with the emotion. Because we look at the fact of receiving too many emails as to some degree of pain, and we connect them to an emotion of anger, of frustration, irritation. That's not wrong in the sense that seeing my mailbox full of 200 emails creates a negative emotion. That's absolutely true. Now, in regard of your relationship with your clients through that communication channel, to think about email fatigue is actually a much better way to think about it than to think about anger and frustration. It doesn't mean that anger and frustration doesn't exist at all, but most of the time that's basically the attitude. It's the morning, I'm checking my email, there's nothing motivating me, engaging me in the moment. I am not angry. I'm not angry at you for sending me this email. First, I mean, the only thing I have to do, if that was really making me so angry, is to click once on the unsubscribe link and that's done. And I still decide not to do that. So anger is not the emotion we're looking for changing. But email fatigue is. And that's something quite wrong. Now, in the logic of email fatigue, then how do our clients perceive hard selling? Because let's face it, this is still the most standard way of sending email. We have an offer, it's 20% off, buy it now. I'm not saying this is the only thing we do, but that's a quite dominant part. And then we have this type of inbox. And then yes, if I see this, the pain of reading it is basically making me bored, making me not engage, making me skip, paying no attention. And the dropping, and we will go through it of course after, but the dropping rate over the years in that channel, which all of you to some degree have felt, is quite understandable, because if you receive this list in the morning, how engaged are you with any of these specific messages? Now, what are the reasons why basically people unsubscribe? Well, I get too many emails, the emails are not relevant to me, I receive too many emails from this company specifically, the emails are always trying to sell me something. And that's the 4 most important reasons why people don't want to be subscribed to a newsletter. Now, let's think about one thing, because when I receive a message from a company, then what will potentially make me have this little bit of emotion saying, hey, what do they send me? In a positive sense. And when you think about it and you make the exercise to, which we can all do because we have it in regards of other companies sending us emails, so we actually are representative in a certain sense, then first is the sender. So if I see the name of someone sending me an email which I connect to hard selling, then even before reading the subject line, my reaction will be, yeah, they probably just tried to sell me something again. and then you're blurred, even regardless of the A/B testing that you do in your subject line, you're blurred over time. And that's the problem with A/B testing email, which is a good practice, don't get me wrong, but A/B testing email on a per case basis. Most of the way people engage with your email is on the distance. Is how do they perpetually and continuously engage with you over time. And this, in general, is not working. It's working less and less, and email fatigue is spreading in a way which is a problem. And I know I'm not starting the keynote on a very positive side, but I think that's really important, first to think about these things in those terms, and to think about where the trend is going and what we can do about it. And to provide first a first glimmer of hope, which of course will be much more extended in the rest of the presentation. The idea should be to say, okay, but is it maybe because we are systematically getting people without knowing when it is the right moment to get to them? And maybe part of the reason why this has happened is this fact. And maybe the moment where people are on your website could be a more appropriate moment to communicate than a random moment in the week when you have no idea whether they are ready and willing and interested to be contacted in a specific way. Not exclusively, but as a combination. And we will go quite deep in that direction. But I just wanted to start with this. Now, just to be clear, there's a few slides which are not bringing positive emotion. The next one is of that kind again. Silo marketing limits your scalability. How is that the case? So first, what do we mean by silo marketing? Silo marketing is basically the idea that you have a certain channel, like email, and you are organizing and doing activities in that channel specifically, while you're doing things in other channels separately. That's the idea of silo marketing. And it limits your scalability as internal budget and resources become exhausted. How does that come to play, and why is that true? Well, the first thing to think about is to think in the reverse sense, to say, let's say that let's take a concrete example of a company making $1 million a year with email activities. Who wants to double that amount? What are the ways to double that amount? Well, actually, with statistics, we can predict that. We can predict that in a relatively clear way. So there is more or less two ways. You send more, or you segment. Huh? That's basically the two ways. Send more meaning, well, because I'm sending more, then maybe I will make more sales. And some companies are sending an email every day compared to once a week or 2 or 3 times per month. So that's one possibility. The other one is, well, we could do by segmentation, because then if we send emails which are more targeted to the interests of the customer, and we segment in a certain split of the customer base, male, women, different age group, different interests, things like that, and we tailor our communication to these segments, then we can achieve more. Now, let's just make the evaluation of what that means and why that doesn't scale if not done in a very specific way. Well, the first thing is that it doesn't work because what you can see here in statistics of that kind, this is the drop rate of the click with the amount of sending you do per month. So if you want to double your returns, you have actually to send not twice more email, you have to send 4 times more email. And that can only work on a short amount of time, because the complaints per week, the spam rates, the unsubscribe rate will grow. So on a short time, by doing 4 times more work, you will temporarily achieve your goal, but not for long. I think we agree that does not scale. That cannot be the solution to achieve more sales by segmentation. Okay, well then we made a bit the study to say, well, what does that mean? Because very often there's a very vague way to think about it. And most companies, when they speak about the value of segmented email, trigger email, and so on and so forth, they give you a percentage. They tell you, well, if you send a segmented email, you will have 2 times, for instance, the conversion rate. Let's take that as a point. Yes, true. Now, what is the percentage of the segment so that you can achieve that statistically. Of course, there are exceptions, but statistically, it's 10%. So we can see here that basically that in order to go from basically like a list of here 10 to 25,000 visits, which would be at 2.9, and I would like to go at 5.7, which is just basically roughly doubling the quantity. I have to send it to 1,000 to 2,000, so basically 10% of my customer base. Now you can say, yeah, but that's sustainable because actually people will not unsubscribe more because they actually receive the same frequency and they are going to have more relevant emails, so we actually address one of the concerns. Everything fine. Yes, except that you have 10 times more work. Except that small part, there's no problem. And we all know that that is a problem. So if you think about it and you don't integrate it in a different approach, which is what we're going to discuss about it, it simply cannot scale. And that matters. That matters. So now, what should we discuss next? One of the biggest mistakes conceptually thinking about inbound and outbound marketing is the idea that these activities generate sales. And of course that sounds kind of weird when I'm saying it, but it is true. Inbound and outbound marketing do not generate sales. They do not. They can originate them to some degree, but they do not. Your business generates sales. And what generates sales is basically the customer journey, which of course needs to be motivated sometimes. Sometimes it's coming from the side of the customer, he's coming to you, and sometimes you're reaching out to him. But that's not what generates sales. Your business generates sales. And in fact, you can more think about this journey as a game in two ways. First, because it's about catching and cultivating and pushing the customer journey to be more active, to be more engaging. But it's also not letting your competitors take their journeys away. So at every moment, there's also a role that you have to capture the attention and to take a part of the journey away from your competitors. But that's interesting because that means that what you really want to capture is a journey. You want to capture the customer journey to be a journey in your environment rather than the environment of your customers. And yes, of course, I completely know the end game is to make money, so it is about selling at the end. But it's not the inbound and outbound marketing which is selling, and that's why it's so important to think about what type of conversion are you tracking, what type of conversion are you looking for. Because you can easily come to the conclusion that yes, hard selling is not a good thing, but it is the only thing which is driving the most sales. That's what we do in the majority of the cases. Yes, because the only thing you measure is immediate sales clicking on the email and nothing else. So that's why to think about these aspects and to think about the customer journey as the thing to be captured and cultivated is a much better way than to think about achieving and generating sales. Now, another interesting way to think about the journeys. Your clients, they don't want to feel, they want to feel like the visitors. They don't want to feel like the animals. What do I mean by that? Well, when you set a specific playground with specific rules, with specific ways that you engage with them or they can engage with you, and you focus on optimizing that, then chances are that you will create fences around these aspects. You will actually create fences between the different points of interaction you give them in their journeys. While, on the contrary, the way to let them have a great journey is to basically create as much freedom as possible between these channels. That means that whenever I decide to come to your website, then your marketing has to adapt to my journey, to me being there at that moment. And if it happens that there's a certain way to engage with you on the email that doesn't work with me, you have to adapt that as well and to stop doing that to some degree. So my journey is what defines the fact that I am happy on the long term to engage with you and with your communication. But silo marketing will create cages. Maybe very nice cages. I mean, this elephant looks pretty happy. It's not the point. But that's not what your clients want. Now, we all have done some kind of decision trees in defining how things should be treated in marketing automation one way or the other. The idea to say, I send an email, if people react this way, then this is what we will do, then we send another email, or we wait, or we thank them, and so on. This tree base of thinking, we all know about it. And I think deep down we all know that this is part of what's not working. It's extremely hard to do, so it's a lot of work. And if you do all of this work and you do it completely, you will have a tree that looks like this. While a journey tree should be something like that. Now, good, you can say, well, easier said than done. I mean, how do you manage that? Because that looks manageable. That doesn't look very manageable. Well, that depends how you look at it. It depends what you're trying to control and what you're trying to influence. But if you try to make this tree looks like that by creating many more decisions, transitions, and rules, chances are you will fail trying. Chances are that you will still have something that looks like this, but with many more transitions. You will have something unmanageable, and it's actually not going to feel like that at all. Now, does it mean we should not use any type of decision tree logic in marketing automation? Of course not, for a lot of things that make sense. But that cannot be the trunk of your tree. It can't be. Because if you build it as the trunk of your tree, that everything is built around the trunk in that way, you will have a tree that looks like that. And you will have the situation that you're trying to control the journey through a decision tree, and that simply does not work. Now, same problem with funnel. Well, you know, marketing funnel works very well, and they're very efficient for many things. But there's one thing they have a tendency not to do, which is very similar to the problem with the decision tree. They will take something like this, and they will turn it into basically a 4-step funnel, and say, that's basically what's happening, that's what we do. And we all have done it to some degree with the checkout process. And we're like, well, you know, that kind of works. Well, yes, it works depending on what you want to measure. But if you want to measure the customer mind states, it doesn't work at all. Because if I'm actually transiting like this or like that, I might be at the same level of the funnel, but my state of mind and my willingness to engage with you in a certain way at that moment is completely different. So we need to have also a better way to capture and manage and optimize our customer state of mind. Again, easier said than done, fair enough. But at least if we agree on what the goal is, we can start to really look for the real solution. Now, fair enough. We should try to look in a holistic way at the customer journey. We should not try to cage people into boxes with different silo marketing approaches. We should not look at their journey in a monolithic and simplistic way. Does it mean that our role is to organize the traffic in this type of hubs? Of course not. But there is something fundamental there, is that, yes, you can say, well, that looks like a mess, basically. How could anyone drive in this type of setup? But the thing is that if you really look at the way customers and their journeys online, they are inherently and strongly chaotic. They are. People don't go through a chain of interaction which is the one you predicted. They go to the start page, then they go see a product, then they go see a blog, then they go back to the start page, then they go see a category. Some of these have nothing to do with each other, then they leave, then they pay no attention to 2 emails, and they click on one, then they restart with one of their prior interests, and they stop. That's the reality of what's happening. That's the reality of their journey. And that's just something which we have to cope with. But we don't have to manage it. We don't have to administrate that in any types of way. So now we get to the next point to say, well, how can we achieve that? How can we control this? And how can we have a top-level view? Because we need them in order to manage these aspects. Well, the first thing that we can do is that we can limit the amount of transitions that matters with different goals. There are transitions, if we think about the customer states and their value states, there are transitions which have a value to happen, transitions which have a value to be basically to keep the status quo, and transitions that should be avoided. And depending on how we structure our approach, there are not so many transitions. So instead of having to be the traffic control of something like this, we can take another role. We can take the role to say, well, how are we measuring the speed in this speedometer? And what are we doing when people are moving up or moving down? And what are we doing to always keep a pressure that it naturally pushes to go up? So from inactive to, well, basically the lead, to new, not to fall into inactive, to go to returning, to go to frequent, to go to top. There's another thing which is interesting about that diagram, which is that if you drive a car and you don't put any gas, what does the car do? It stops. So does your customer journey if you stop doing anything. Exactly the same way. So the default, that's why I think the analogy is good. The default behavior of customers is to forget about you. That's what they will do by default. In the same way as if I'm on the highway, I stop putting on the gas, I don't have cruise control, I just wait, my car will eventually stop. Maybe it will take a lot of time because there's not too much friction, it's not too much wind, I'm already at 120, but that's what's happening. So the goal of, in that sense, omnichannel marketing automation, but the goal of marketing in general, when it comes to existing leads and existing customers, is to always keep a foot on the gas pedal, to always push against that natural flow to go down. Now, there are specific things, so now we can say, well, that's just to mean we should just do that as a de facto thing. Yes, but how and when does it really matter? Well, it matters that when people are here as a new customer, it matters a lot that we push them to go here. It's a quite specific transition, this C2 specific transition, which is very important. Now, why is it very important? Because you spend a lot of money to acquire a new customer. And the amount of money that you should be willing to pay to acquire a new customer should be directly connected to the overall customer lifetime value you typically get. Well, that will be affected a lot by how many of these people stop at the first purchase and then move down, and how many of these actually are becoming returning. That will make a gigantic difference in the lifetime value of these specific customers. So that's a transition which really matters a lot. Of course, this one as well, because it's part of the acquisition process. And then, of course, these ones as well, and we want to prevent the other movements as well. So, and then we want to make sure that when it's returning, it's this constant pressure to push it up, pressure to push it up, pressure to push it up. Now, how many transitions is that? Not so many. Not so many. So basically, we have 5 green transitions, 3 gray transitions, and 4 red transitions. So instead of taking the impossible task to control the traffic here, we can focus on the task of making sure that we are pushing the speedometer to the right continuously, but also specifically for all of the important transitions. Now, again, I'm taking kind of a a kind of antithetical approach here, saying, well, you know, Boxalino is all about real-time personalization and real-time automation, but what I'm saying is that individualized is not always more relevant and autopilot is not always advisable. The reason we're saying that is simply because this is true. This is simply true. What people will feel relevant does not mean it has to be personal. In many cases it might have to, but not always. It's not at all the golden rule. So personalization is not the goal. Autopilot is not the goal. Now, it might be a necessary means to achieve the goal, but it is not the goal. And that's why personalized automation value is squeezed out as 4 different kinds of fruit. And that's very important to think about these as different kinds of fruit, because it's not the same thing, and they are not mutually interchangeable, and they cannot cover each other, take the place of each other. And these 4 boxes are basically the 4 boxes of this quadrant, from manual to automated, from general to personal. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, I've not met one of our clients who is not interested to go in the green part. I would like to have personalized, automated email. Usually it's followed by the sentence, and that's it. Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, should we do that? Absolutely we should. Absolutely we should. And let's think about it. It's like we have to. If we know that to double the sales we have to do 10 times more email, how on earth are we going to do it only on the right part? It's impossible. It's absolutely and utterly impossible. So we need to do that. But we also need to do that, which means that we need to have also automation about things which are not necessarily personalized. And that's also very important. And if it's well done and done in a wise way, it will be relevant to the customers. It's not only because it's personalized that it's relevant, it's also because it's at the right time and it's something of real relevance which is done. And it's a timely information. Now it's also, the opposite is also true, that we should not consider that autopilot is the way to get the market, because at the end, whatever way to get the customer journeys and capture them as often and as compellingly as possible is the right way. So we need to make room for a certain amount of segmented campaigns that you manage. And this has to be done in a way which is very comfortable, very efficient, very effective, that will drop the amount of unit effort in a significant way. And finally, we still need to keep a certain part of your blast general activity. Now, does it mean that it should go to everyone at the same time? Not necessarily. But this is also important, because this is also where you can say your company story, what's happening, why, what the values that you're fighting for, which everyone should care. There's something important you're doing about them, and you want to let people know about that. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's part of the point. There's nothing wrong with doing newsletter as companies typically do, to some extent. There's something completely wrong in doing only that I agree, but there's nothing wrong with doing that to some extent. And the right mix of campaigns here, 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 and here is the right way to capture as much as the value as possible. Now, what are the important things to balance in doing that? Because it's like, okay, fine, we want to do emails which are related to the different state of the customer value, from inactive to new to returning to frequent to top customers. We want to do that. We want to do that with content which is personalized when it should be personalized, not personalized when it shouldn't be, on autopilot as often as it makes sense, and not on autopilot when it makes sense to do it in a more tailored and editorial way. But how to carry this message to the people in the right way? And then comes 4 interesting tolerance factors: the privacy, the frequency, the repetition, and the quantity. Privacy is very important. Everyone speaks about it. Now, we have to think about what privacy means in terms of tolerance. And basically, it's a lot about perception rather than the reality of something to be personalized or not. So, for instance, it might be that when you have an insight message, people just come, they did not log because they logged maybe before, and they just come and they see the name of their pet advertised in a communication there. It might be that you're hurting their feeling of privacy, much more than if the same information would be sent by an email. That might be the case. There's also potentially other cases, but that might be the case. So privacy matters, because that means that depending on the channel, the moment, the situation, the prior interaction of the customer, the feeling of invading privacy will change. And that should affect the way we're sending the communication at the right person in the right way. So that's frequency. I mean, that's an obvious thing we have seen before. It's like, well, we need to control marketing pressure. That has to be part of what the system controls, manages, and optimizes. Repetition is also important. If basically you have the feeling that you have a templated email with the offer of the week, which is the same every week, just with a different product which have vague interest for, but nothing really in particular, that will increase my feeling of repetition. Now, if every time I'm excited about what you're showing me, if you re-show me something that I liked the last time, repetition might be positive. But in many other cases, it might be the opposite. So repetition is also a factor of importance, which is different than frequency. And finally, which is obvious, quantity. An email of 2 kilometers long is not the same as an email of 1 page, and that will also play a factor. So all of these aspects is what we call the balance of tolerance. And they have to play a role into the thing. Now let's start to go into the solution. So what is the solution? Well, first what we have done is that we have defined a canvas for defining communication. To say, well, taking all of these things into consideration, taking all of these problems, all of these challenges, how can we come up with a canvas that is manageable, which addresses all of these things at once? And the first thing is that we realized that we need, and we decided to separate it in 3 key parts: content, audience, and conveyance. I know conveyance is kind of a complex term, but that's the best we found, because it's not the same as targeting, it's not the same as triggering. It's really the way you carry your message. So to make it simple, that's what you speak about. This is to whom you speak about it, and that's the way you carry the information to them. Fair enough? Okay. Now, that's what it looks like. So basically, the idea is that content-wise, we have these 3 boxes: the teaser, the main content, and the side content. The teaser, basically, you can look at it like this. It's the subject line, who is the sender, and the first line, because we all know, especially on the email, the first line appears as a preview of the email. So for us, that's part of what we consider is the teaser. Then we have the main content. And again, that's a model. It doesn't have to be followed exactly, but we believe that the start and the end of the message should be where the main content is. Because what people do is that they are confronted with a message, they pay attention to the first part, they scroll to it, then they get to the bottom of it and they decide what to do now. So to plan for focusing the key information at the start and at the end and put the side content in the middle is not a bad idea. And that's thankfully quite generalizable and automatable, especially the part of the side content. Now we have these different mind states: awareness, consideration, evaluation, purchase, inactive, new, returning, top, frequent, and top. Well, these are all things that we can indicate not as filtering rules, but to say this message that we're writing is mainly focusing on the new customer, because we would like to transform them into returning, for instance, or another one. Doesn't need to be exclusive, but that clearly puts the focus in a certain direction. Then we have this position on these quadrants. Is it more like on the green part, on the blue part, depending on the communication that you do? And then we have this tolerance, basically, to say, well, how do we feel about how this message is in regard of privacy, frequency, repetition, and quantity? You can look at it as just weights to say, well, how important are these things? And then finally, what is the scheduling and the channel that we want to do? So let's just take a stop for just a few seconds to think about it. So now, what do we have, which what we covered so far we know how to do, and what is still not very clear? That we have to write content for the teaser, the main content, and side content. Of course, it's not maybe clear yet how to do it precisely, but the fact that there need to be some kind of CMS capacity that you can define these things, potentially with some dynamism, I think that's something which we can all agree is clear in what it means. The audience, well, that basically, sorry, I forgot the audience before, so to say, well, which type of CRM segment or which type of online behavior is triggering the fact that people receive that message. That we can define. We can say, okay, well, that's a message we want to send 2 weeks after a purchase, for instance, and that's basically the definition. It's a behavior, purchase, 2 weeks. So now we can basically define some elements here as indicators, but we don't really know what to do with them. So we can just basically say, well, you know, this kind of fits here, it's kind of focusing on that, it's kind of these levels. Maybe there's a best time here, it should be, as I said, like 2 weeks after the purchase. That's the part which is actually hard to do. And if we go back to the problematic of the tree, the decision tree, that's exactly what would be a hurdle to define solely in the marketing automation of a system like MailChimp. So that's what I would like to now start to discuss, if that's okay for you. So, for the ones who know the picture and ask me the question, no, we didn't get the right from Tesla to reuse their picture. We just stole it from the internet. But I thought it was pretty cool and quite appropriate because it's about conveyance. It's about a pretty new technology to do that in a pretty meaningful way. But of course, we will not put this picture on our website for that reason. Now, I thought a lot about what is the easiest way to explain what our approach for this conveyance model is. Because at the end, I think that's, if there's one thing that comes out as the kernel of this keynote, for me it should be that. And it is like that. So let's imagine that we have a specific person on Monday. And we have, according to the different communication which have been done, here we take the idea that there are 3 communication, so 3 messages if you want, which have been defined. Please rate your last purchase, your loyalty points run out, weekly news. Of course, there can be many more. Just for the example, let's imagine that these are the 3 on record and the 3 apply to him in the coming week. So that's the content. That's the desired planned time, because that's basically the best practice. 1 week after delivery for the ratings, 2 days before the end of the loyalty points are running out, and we are typically sending the weekly news on Saturday morning. Let's take that as an example. Now, target audience is defined because we just said this person qualifies for these 3 messages for that week. So now the only question is, what about the conveyance? How do we bring these messages in the right way to him? And of course, the answer is, it depends on his behavior. It depends on his behavior. So let's imagine that on Tuesday, he's coming online. Then this message, which is, please rate your last purchase, which is planned for 1 week after delivery, is already shown to him as an insight message. So tell him, oh, glad that you're there. Do you want to rate your purchase? And he does the rating. Done. What does that affect in our conveyance planning for him? Well, of course, that actually removes the need to send him a message the next day. But the 2 others are still there. Now, why didn't his system show the red one here? Well, because the distance here is quite big compared to this one. Of course, this is all things which are depending on parameters. It's not that it's impossible, but that's the reason. So that's basically what the system does. It basically says, okay, he's coming online. Let's take this opportunity to address this rating. Now, let's think about it. What is the probable conversion rate of this versus what was planned? Most likely significantly higher. Because he's already engaged on the website, he's already there, he's already thinking about you, he has to do his rating, he's invited to do it. Compared to you contact him at a relatively random moment from his perspective to ask him to do something and to take some time to go to your website to complete a task. Significantly better conversion rate of that activity and hopefully of other aspects as well. Then 2 days later he comes again. Then the system says, oh, okay, well now I can show him this information about his loyalty points. I can show him that because that is now quite near, and he should be informed about that. And oh well, you know, we already have this message ready. It was planned to be on Saturday, but you know, why not to show it on Thursday? Obviously you can indicate a minimum time here to say no, it cannot be sent before Saturday, and then that would not happen. But if that's possible, then the system would try to do it. Then then let's look at what the person does. He opens the blue one, so he opens the weekly news, but he doesn't pay any attention to his loyalty points. Then what does the system do then? He says, okay, I still plan to send him the email tomorrow because this is really important. So I don't accept that he didn't open it. That's not okay. He needs to know about that. But the blue one, he read it, so it's okay. I'm not going to bother him with this on Saturday. Then sends the message, but he doesn't open it. Maybe because he's a person who just typically doesn't open email. It's possible, or maybe simply he didn't see. But that's still very important. That's still very important. So the day before it's over, you send him an SMS. Now, there's something I love about this diagram, is that compared to a lot of things that I do, and I'm sure you will agree with me, it's not that complicated. I've done a lot of diagrams which are much more complicated than that. I think you all agree. It's not that complicated, yet it is significantly better than what everyone is doing today. Significantly better. So that's the idea. That's the idea of the conveyance model. Now, of course, it implies a lot of things. In the infrastructure part, it implies that we have communication which are interchangeably renderable in different channels. Yes, we need to cover that. It requires that we have a centralized system which is keeping track of all of the channels to decide these things. Yes, it implies all these things. So it's something which has consequences in the way you can operate your business. But what it does, once it is set up and configured properly, is actually pretty clear, pretty simple, and pretty efficient. Now, let's move to the next part, because one part we didn't address so far is the hard selling part, which was the beginning of the idea. And there's one thing which is very often difficult to understand about what's wrong with hard selling. There are many things which are wrong with hard selling, but there's one thing which is typically hard to understand, thinking about what the customer wants, because we can say, well, if we know what the customer wants, and we know that these things are important for him, and we know he bought it, then why don't we just push it and say, buy this for 20%, you should care. What's wrong with that if it's personal, if it's apparently relevant? And there's one thing which, at least some of the time, is quite wrong with that. And it is about the speed. And that's what's so important about stories. Telling a story is like walking together. It's not about running. It's not about getting the information immediately. That's not at all what telling a story is about. If I tell you what happened in an action movie in 5 minutes, it's not the same as watching the movie. It's not the same at all. Even if the information, you can say, well, you know, what I got out of the movie is exactly that, but the movie was about the journey. It was about going through that narrative at the pace that makes sense. So think about communicating with your customers, not like running, but walking together with them. And that's a good thing, because you will have more of their attention. You will have more of their attention if they spend more time walking with you than if you just say, don't want to take any of your time, buy this if you want, otherwise I don't bother you. No, that does not work. Walk with me. Let me tell you about why we selected that product, what type of problems people have without it, why it's reflecting our values. And of course, yes, you're also getting a good deal out of it. But yes. But this journey part, this walking together, is an essential part of breaking the hard selling barrier. So, how could that be represented? Well, let's imagine that we take one story, which we split in 3 narratives. The first story, basically, there's a teaser, explanation about the situation before. I had in mind, for instance, the case of Perfect Hair for a new product about what's going to happen to me probably soon, which is about losing my hair. So taking this is like, well, you know, the life before is that you were young, your hairs were there. that is changing. And it is changing. And that actually is the introduction of the communication. Then there's a second narrative, which is about that's the problem which is arriving. You start losing your hair. Now, you have a glimpse about peak darkness. That's important, because if the problem you're solving is not important, then why should I pay attention to it? So it's counterintuitive, but the bigger the peak darkness, the more important the solution. But then hope emerged. So we don't leave him hanging with the peak problem in the middle communication. And then this hope is confirmed. It really works. The solution wins. What next? And we think about it, any type of communication, you could structure it like this. Doesn't mean that you have to, doesn't mean that you should, but you could structure it like this. So now, what does that mean? What are the different possible ways to carry that message? Of course, you can say it's one story with 3 engagement steps. You can say, well, I take the teaser part, that's what I sent in my message. Then he comes on the page where he sees the full narrative with the 3, and then he gets to a converting results. So one story, 3 engagement steps. And sometimes that's the best way, because there are some stories which should be written, should be explained like that. Now, why is it working together? Well, because you don't try to give him everything at first. You start the journey, you take the time to put all of the key elements of the journeys in order, and then you move to the action point. But you can do it different ways. You can have the multi-message of one story. You can say, well, no, actually what I'm going to do, I'm only going to send that, then I'm only going to send that, and then I'm only going to send that, but at any moment he can go and click and see the full story. That's different. That means that you have 3 reasons to contact him in a continuated mode, but you don't leave him hanging or her hanging without knowing what's the next of the story, because if your client takes time to click and to come to the website, maybe he wants to read the rest of the story now. So you make that possible. The full story is here, but you only communicate 3 parts. And of course you can say, yeah, well, you know, I'm actually, you know, that's kind maybe for some cases, but I'm going to do shorter story than that, because that's kind of long and it doesn't work for every cases. But what I'll do is that basically I will package them as story, and I will send them repetitively, and I will basically create what we call micro story that we communicate through multi-messages. And then in the way it is communicated, the customer knows that on a regular basis he will receive next step, next step, next step story, even if each story is a story in itself. And there's not one of the 3 which is right and one which is wrong, but there are 3 very concrete ways to manage it. So now here what we have are the type of stories. So of course there are many different types of stories, but the 5 which are the most important that we have identified to fight the only hard-selling approach are these 5. You have the use case. Here are the results other clients achieved. That's something which is easy to tell as a story, because that's the story of the customer. That's kind of the most obvious one. They had this situation, they were looking for this, or maybe in your case, Johannes, the story of the winemaker. It's a story, it's a use case, and I can learn and read about that. Then we have the reason why story, which are very important. Here's the reason why we're making this offer. Spending time explaining why you are selecting a product might be just as important as what the product is, especially if you create a relationship of trust with your customer about your expertise, about how you're filtering. But you cannot say, yeah, our customers know that we are good in quality, so they assume that we select things in a good way. No, that should be part of your communication. This is how we come to select that product. This is why we selected it. The reason why is a way to give the evidence to your customers that you are a qualitative provider, that you have done a meaningful work in selecting the product. Tell them about it. And that's easy to do in a story mode. Then you have the origin story. what does the company stand for? Why does a company exist to start with? And how are our value and why we started this company and why we started offering this product in that way, again represented in what we're communicating now. It's another example of origin values. Here's an example of what we always stood for. We always stood for high quality food for animals. That's why we selected this one. We always stood for long-term beauty for our customers. That's why we selected that one. We always stood for having huge assortment but making it the life easy for our customers. This is another example of that. Everything you do to some degree, it's kind of normal when you think about it. You want to strengthen your USP. What is your USP? Well, it's very connected to what your company stands for. Well, that is good material for a story. And then vision. Well, that's what we're trying to do. So it can be an announcement or something you plan to do. It's really something that will come. But that's basically a thing. You don't need to only speak about what you're doing now, of why you're doing things or why you always did things, but also what you plan to do in advance. We inform you in advance that this will come. And there's a good news. And we wanted to let you know about that because you would mention. And of course you have also the rapport building. You can basically create a lot of rapport building email, and in some cases it's much easier than others, but definitely if you have a modus operandi which is recurrent, like for instance a subscription or something like that, that makes these type of things much more easy because you always have some kind of reason to cultivate the communication. So that does not mean you should just change your business model for that reason. There are many ways to do rapport building in a transactional model, but the subscription model is fantastic for the rapport building because the customers is saying, hey, I'm giving you a blank check on a continuous basis to basically continue furnishing me things. So if you don't hear from me, that means I'm okay to do that. Well, then you have a relationship to maintain, and there's always a reason why to communicate with people. Did you like our last thing? We're thinking about sending this in our subscription. What do you think about it? Would that be something that you would like to have or not to have? Of course, you can also connect it with upselling your subscription, many different things for business reasons, but it's also a great vehicle for stories. So unlike what I thought at the beginning, also when I think about stories, it's actually there are many models and ways that you can tell stories as an online retailer and make a difference compared to your competitors. And we believe that our approach and our environment with the narrative is a great way to do that, because you could even imagine that you create one time the story in the narrative and you actually dispatch it in different ways to different people without redefining the story several times, just based on the way that I define it here. So that's another part which in our view is really quite important. And then I come to the last slide of my presentation, which is to say, okay, there is the content, I understand that. The content is configured like in any CMS, but in a very advanced CMS, which is done with a narrative. The narrative are interchangeable throughout many different channels without any specific effort. So if I define the narrative, it can be displayed in any channel. I know how to define who should be receiving that message, and I can describe a certain amount of things about my message to basically feed the information in regards of how should this conveyance model work. But how do I manage it, and how do I administer? How does it work? If it's not a tree, how does it work? How does it take these decisions, and how can it come to these behaviors like we saw before with the example conveyance? And the way that we think about it is much more to think about strings. It's much more adapted to think about strings than to speak about a tree. If you define a tree, then either the system follows the tree or it doesn't. But if you create strings, then you create strong or weak influencers. So maybe the tolerance is pushing down the communication 1 and the communication 4 for that specific person at that specific moment in that specific channel for different reasons. Potentially because he already reacted negatively to this type of communication because of the tolerance, or maybe because in general you indicated that this message is quite delicate when it comes to the privacy tolerance. So it can be because you indicated something specific, or it can be because that's what we have learned of that specific customer behavior preference. Now we have also the planned time. Say, well, you define that you would like the message to be sent 2 weeks after the transition. So that's an attractor. Definitely, there's a strong string there. It's like, okay, well, I said Monday. Now, yes, okay, maybe it's Sunday, maybe it's a Tuesday. I can tolerate that, but I don't want it a week before, a week after. So the stronger the connection here, the more the system has to obey to your indicated planning. Now, personal relevance. Well, is it something which is related to what this specific customer already bought, already did, already clicked on, already read? Well, high, medium, or low. Is it pushing it up, or is it pushing it down? And finally, the importance. Is it a really important message? Well, if it's really important, that's pulling it up. So that's exactly it. Now you can say, yeah, but I cannot manage all of these weights. It's impossible, because I would need to manage all of these weights for every customer in every situation, every channel in real time. Of course it's not possible. And that's why we're building this big data processing solution, because that's exactly what these systems do. You start with of course, partial configuration to say, to the best of my knowledge, and of course of the time I have, this is what I can indicate of what the system should do, that it fits to some degree in the model I would like to carry out. When this is done, you have some kind of base. It's very similar to the way we configure the recommendation, for that matter. Because what do we do in the recommendation? First, we define rules. So yeah, this should be quite strong, this is also strong, this is only for these cases, but that's important here, cross-selling, upselling, personalization, and so on and so forth. Exactly the same thing. But we can only do it to some degree. Well, we can do exactly the same for the conveyance, exactly the same. We can configure these rules up to a certain degree, and then our system, instead of recommending product, our system can recommend a planning of communication, which is optimizing with the score the order of this communication with their dates, their planned dates. Now, of course, it will only act on the communication that should be sent now. So you can say it's pointless that it's actually doing the planning, but that's not really the case, because when you're testing the system, you're saying, well, is it doing it well? You'd like to see the planning. You'd like to see what is planned for that customer. You would like to see this view to say, oh, this customer, what is this plan that this person will see? And you would like to see it all. You don't want the system to just tell you nothing, because today nothing. No, you'd like to see, Tuesday, Wednesday this, Friday this, Saturday this, that you can evaluate whether the system is doing a good job. Well, think about these 3 things as the first 3 product recommendations in a recommendation. It's exactly the same thing, except that instead of considering product properties, it's considering communication properties. But the strategies are set the same way, the logic is set the same way, it's done in real time, continuously, every time, of course, the person comes to the website, for sure, but also on a regular basis, every hour or every half an hour, depending on the frequency. And when it comes to the point, it is now, then something happens. Otherwise, nothing happens. But you can still see the planning. And then, exactly in the same way, we can optimize anything. Whether it is the right banner for the right person, the right blog article on the right product page, we can optimize the strategy to prioritize and plan this communication. And then, with what Google is doing and what we are building here, we are basically going to integrate here and provide here the entire information of every communication ever displayed, ever sent in the context that the customer had at that moment, so that we can do reporting and see how is it working, and how is it working when the system is sending that on a Saturday morning to these type of people, and is that good or is it bad, so that we can understand it better and so that we can update our rule. But also that we can do queries which are directly balancing these weights. And of course that's the goal. The goal is that all of these strings, all of the weight of these strings over time should be self-defined by the learning done in this big data processing environment. And that's the quadrature of the circle. Because with that, you have now the full omnichannel capacity in your hands. So I thank you very much for your attention.